So a couple of weeks ago, I had a lightning round video that quickly reviewed a bunch of recent Supreme Court news, ranging from gerrymandering ruling to the fact that Kennedy had just retired. But there was one ruling that I had to avoid because of time constraints that I wish I could have gotten to because of its importance. Janus v. AFSCME, aka the case that union people were absolutely freaking out about. Full disclosure before we even get into it, I was prodded into producing this video by my good friend and friend of the channel, Bobby Mermer. He's a fan of how I present social science topics and thought that it'd be good if I talked about this issue. And he isn't penning polemics about first past the post voting in YouTube comments. He's a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Florida whose research focuses on union power and congressional action. He's also co-president of the union that I happen to belong to, GAU, which tries to help graduate students at my university. And we are both senators for the United Faculty of Florida, which is a union that represents faculty members as well as graduate students for the entire state of Florida. Because of all that, I feel like it would be a bit disingenuous to present this video as if I didn't have any skin in the game. I mean, you can ask Bobby. I personally happen to hold views about unions in general that would probably rankle the rest of the rank and file. But even with that, because of my proximity and personal involvement in the issue, it'd be pretty easy for people to dismiss what I'm saying because of perceived bias. And as an educator and someone dedicated to investigating the truth, that's the last thing that I want. But because I can't fully divorce myself from this, I'm going to take a page out of the Filter Franco book and how I address this topic. I'm going to give you the facts of the case, what the arguments were, and then I'm going to offer my opinion. That way you can learn why it's an objectively big deal, and then you can stick around if you want to see how I feel about it. Although I do hope that you actually stick around because, honestly, I even surprised myself on how I came down on this. Alright, let's start with the background. Janus v. AFSCME started when the Illinois governor Bruce Rauner sued the AFSCME, which stands for the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. It's an alphabet soup as it is. I've had to take this take multiple times to get through without stuttering, but he took them to federal court, arguing that they were forcing people who were not union members to support things that they did not necessarily agree with through compulsory financial contributions. The case was dismissed by the court since they felt that Rauner wasn't himself injured by the law and thus didn't have standing. See, there's that pesky standing thing again that we talked about in the lightning round video. A few state employees, however, came forward and offered to continue the grievance on behalf of the governor, and the court recognized that, unlike said governor, they actually had standing. Mark Janus, a child support specialist, was one of those employees to do so, hence how the case got its name. Janus and the other individuals who came onto the case argued that they were forced to pay money to unions that they didn't support simply by virtue of them being public sector employees. As is commonly known, unions don't just act on behalf of their members directly, but also indirectly via endorsing candidates and making campaign contributions. The courts had already opined decades ago that forcing people to support these political activities was unconstitutional, but that unions could still extract money in exchange for services that they perform on behalf of the workers directly, such as navigating things like contract negotiations and employee-employer grievances. These payments are commonly referred to as agency dues and were upheld by the Supreme Court in Abood v. Detroit Board of Education in 1977. Janus, however, argued that he didn't just disagree with the AFSCME from a political perspective, but also that he didn't agree with the way that they went about bargaining on his behalf or on the topics that they advanced at the table, such as, what kinds of things should be on the health plans, etc. Not only did the Supreme Court agree with him, they did so in a way that actually fully overturned the precedent of Abood. In a 5-4 ruling split largely down ideological lines, Justice Alito wrote on behalf of the majority that Abood had gotten it all wrong, and that it was unconstitutional to force union members to pay dues and agency fees if they didn't want to. Full stop. Abood rested on the logic that agency fees were necessary for maintaining workplace serenity and avoiding the free rider problem. The former argument is pretty contested, and in my opinion maybe rightfully so, but the latter one, the free rider problem, that's something that unions have been dealing with for decades. I'm actually not going to go into the nuts and bolts of the free rider problem here solely because of the fact that it is one of the most important conceptual contributions that the social sciences have ever given, and thus deserves a video all on its own. But the gist of it is as follows. If a service is provided for free and there's nothing stopping people from using it, why would they bother to pay for it? Translated for the case of unions, if unions are going to advocate for all workers, regardless if they're members of the union or not, why would anyone actually bother to pay the union dues? Janus ruling recognized the perniciousness of the free rider problem, but Alito pushed back, claiming that overcoming the free rider problem didn't represent a legitimate state interest. All this can sound a bit wonky if you're not immersed in the world of unions, or if you're like me, aren't closely associated with a friend who is very enthusiastically linked to the world of unions. So here's why this is such a big deal. Many individual states have already adopted rules similar to those spelled out by the Janus decision when it comes to private sector unions. These are called right-to-work states and constitute over half of the United States. In fact, right-to-work laws have been legal in the private sector since the late 1940s. Janus, however, was focused on public sector unions, or those unions comprised of state, local, or federal employees. Public sector unions tend to be the strongest here in the United States due to the amount of money and members that they have. Way more people in the public sector are part of a union than those who are in the private sector, and people receiving union benefits in general tend to have higher pay than those who don't. A state of affairs that many experts attribute to the rules that Janus had just repealed. The concern that many pro-union people have is that this ruling will continue to degrade the power and presence of American unions, which in turn can lower workplace quality. That being said, there is a legitimate speech concern that has been recognized by the courts since the 1940s and 50s, similar to those evoked by Janus. Unlike elected officials, once a union is established by at least 50% plus one of the employees, it exclusively acts on behalf of the other 49% indefinitely. And that 49% may not have a means of redressing their issues with the union without becoming a dues-paying member, which could lead to their money supporting political positions that they themselves don't support. In short, there's definitely a tightrope that the courts have to walk, and balancing speech rights and those of the union is definitely an unenviably tough decision to make. That seems like as good a place as any to transition into my opinion on the topic. So I'm normally a pretty big free speech guy, so as I sat down and started researching this topic, I fully expected to be concluding this video by saying, this really sucks for the power of the unions, but in a democracy, free speech is, if not paramount, pretty dang close. But after having looked at everything, that's actually not what I find myself believing. In fact, I almost am advocating the exact polar opposite. And I say almost because my arguments are still coming from a First Amendment perspective. I'm just, in a surprising move even to myself, leaning in favor of the unions. Alito and the majority argue that mitigating the free rider problem doesn't constitute a compelling state interest. And while I would tend to agree that the problem isn't intrinsically a compelling state issue, I would say that it qualifies in this case because A, is effectively state imposed, and B, subsequently dampening the rights of the unions to free assembly. Between Congress and the Supreme Court, there has been a lot of regulations and rules governing the actions of unions. This includes exclusivity and duty of fair representation. Exclusivity, affirmed in the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, which reinforced earlier court precedents, mandated that any union voted on by over 50% of the employees in that unit get exclusive rights to bargain on behalf of all employees in matters of contract negotiations, grievances, pay, etc. Duty of fair representation, also affirmed by court cases and federal law in the 1940s, means that unions have to represent all workers, union or otherwise, equally when it comes time to negotiate or redress grievances, even if they aren't dues-paying members. It's been effectively determined that should employees choose to unionize, the union has no choice but to advocate and represent everybody. The courts are effectively saying that they must provide a service that has value to the employees, and that said employees are guaranteed to get it without consequence if they decide to not pay for it, unless they get a great deal of pleasure from identifying and helping with the union in and of itself. What rational person would continue to pay? Some people may see this scenario and say to themselves, well, that's just the price of unionizing. If employees don't like that price, if they don't like the idea of a losing proposition, then they just shouldn't form a union. But denying employees the ability to unionize undermines the First Amendment's guarantee to freedom of assembly. It also ignores the fact that the creation of a union doesn't have to be a losing proposition. Here's where I'm probably going to piss off some pro-union folks. There is no emergent universal law dictating that unions be the exclusive negotiator for all members of the shop, and that they provide benefits to all employees regardless of if they pay dues or not. Those are impositions placed upon them by federal law. Thinking back to Janus's objections, the ending of exclusivity and repealing the need for fair provisions would probably be another solution to the sorts of things that he's arguing about. And in that case, if you don't want to support the union and how it negotiates a raise, that would end up being totally fine. The catch then would be, you just don't get the raise. If you want the benefits of memberships, you would actually have to be, well, members. It's definitely a radical change that I don't necessarily see happening immediately, but this sort of court decision is could possibly be pushing things in that direction. As it stands now, at least in my opinion, mandating that unions have to represent and advocate for all employees while denying them the ability to demand payment for those services stands to just weaken the existential standing of unions in generally, and subsequently limits the union's right to free association. So yeah, honestly surprised myself on how I feel about all this. So I'm curious to see what you guys think about public sector unions and the Janus case more generally, thoughts that cropped up while watching this video, or suggestions for future topics. Bobby offered this one a while ago, Rio Mio suggested one on the drug wars, and Hydrogen 1 in the last video suggested one about the Internet Bill of Rights. I've been researching those topics to try to do them justice, so I do take your suggestions seriously. Last week we talked about plastic straws and how through media framing and effective polarization, it becomes such a surprisingly heated topic. Y'all left some comments, so let's do some responses. So Huey Iroquois left 2 comments that I felt were worth responding to. The first asked whether bamboo straws were actually all that good, and I actually didn't have an answer to that question until I happened to go to a local trivia night last week. I noticed while I was there, serendipitously, that the straws were now paper instead of single-use plastic. So I can't speak about bamboo, but the paper worked perfectly fine. Just don't play with it with your fingers, because I think the oils from your hands will mess up the straw more so than the liquids in the sodas did. So yeah, I actually used it for 2 drinks, and it worked out fine. The other comment was him insisting that people were mad because people were virtue signaling and trying to get the straws banned, and that there are loads of other issues that people could be focusing their attention on. I want to strongly push back on that first point, because the term virtue signaling implies that people don't actually believe the stuff that they're saying. They're just doing it to maintain some sort of credential. But as I mentioned in that video, these are issues that are talked about in ways that tend to gel with larger narratives that people really earnestly gravitate towards. The vast preponderance of people in favor of replacing plastic straws are probably very sincere in that belief. The internet has a tendency of selecting the most hyperbolic representations of things out there. It's very helpful to remember that real life does not always translate to the virtual and vice versa. And also, I don't necessarily think it's wrong to focus on a topic that's relatively simple and easy to solve. That's like saying that Congress shouldn't deal with naming new post offices because we have homeless kids and veterans. One thing is way simpler to accomplish than the other, and I don't think that people should be penalized for pursuing it, provided of course that they don't just do that and completely neglect the other stuff. But there's no indication that these cities passing these laws are just going, alright, I guess we're done with that. Good luck on the homelessness, skyrocketing housing rates, and the waste management problems. I think that this sort of pushback comes from the fact that people don't really believe that the straws were that much of a problem in the first place, which is a legitimate feeling, but we should start the debate from there, not from the idea that it's too frivolous to be worth any attention. I also just wanted to give a quick shout out to Hydrogen 1 and the Brony Viking, both of whom respectfully challenged something that I said in the video, and I feel like we were able to come to some sort of consensus in the comment section somewhere in the middle of our respective original positions. I wanted to highlight them because I think that that sort of exchange really exemplifies what I feel is the promise and potential of this channel. Social science is not only really tough to study rigorously, communicating it is a challenge as well because of how it tends to intersect with things that people feel really strongly about. Like, it'd be way easier for me to do a calculus proof of ordinary least squares regression than, say, to do a video on the gender wage gap, because unless you're like really into the philosophical underpinnings of statistics, you probably don't have very strong beliefs about regression. But you might have strong beliefs about the wage gap based upon previous stuff that you've seen that are probably presented with, not the highest amount of rigor. But there's an objective truth undergirding the gender wage gap, just as there is about the plastic straw outrage and most other topics in the social sciences. Even those things derived from subjective experiences can still be understood and incorporated into the grand corpus of human knowledge, just as long as it's done right. I've always wanted this channel to be a place where truth is allowed to come out, where people can state their principled reasons as to why they may disagree or agree with an analysis that I've made or disagree with each other in the comments section, and allow us to get a greater, clearer glimpse of that elusive truth. Respectful deliberation is imperative in science, in education, and in communication, so I just wanted to highlight those exchanges in appreciation. That's all that we have for today. Thank you guys so much for your comments. I truly enjoyed reading all of them. I try to get to them as best as I can. Links for everything is always down in the doobie-doo, as well as links to Facebook, Twitter, and the blog. Look forward to seeing you guys out there as well. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you consider giving it a thumbs up. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by commenting down below, by sharing this video, and by subscribing to the channel to stay in the loop for more awesome social science content as uploaded. If you want to be guaranteed to be in the loop when I upload a new video, be sure to click the bell icon as well. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.